A mother is supposed to be a child's first protector, but in some of the most disturbing true crime cases, that trust was shattered by the person a child depended on most. Tonight, we're looking at 10 mothers who were convicted of killing their own children and the investigations that eventually uncovered the truth. On case number 10, this is the story of Marie Noe. For almost 2 decades, people in Philadelphia believed Marie Noe was one of the unluckiest mothers imaginable. Between 1949 and 1968, 8 of her babies died, one after another. And for years, doctors and investigators believed they were looking at a tragic series of unexplained infant deaths. There was no obvious killer, no obvious crime scene, and no reason, at least on the surface, to believe that the mother herself was responsible. But decades later, authorities would discover that the explanation was far darker. This is the story of Marie Noe, a mother who eventually pleaded guilty to killing 8 of her own children. Marie and her husband, Arthur Noe, lived in Philadelphia. Over the years, they had 10 children, but 8 of those children died during infancy between 1949 and 1968. The children were extremely young. According to contemporary reports, the 8 who died were between approximately 13 days and 14 months old. At the time, the deaths were generally attributed to what was then called sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS. There was no criminal prosecution, no murder conviction, and for decades, the family was viewed primarily as a family struck by an unimaginable series of tragedies. 2 other children also died, but investigators later determined that those deaths were from natural causes rather than murder. The situation was extraordinary. 1 infant death could be considered a terrible medical mystery, but 8 children from the same family dying in infancy should eventually raise questions. And years later, advances in the understanding of unexplained infant deaths helped investigators take another look at cases like Noe's. The Noe case remained largely dormant for decades. Then an investigative journalist, Stephen Freed, began looking into the deaths. His investigation, published in Philadelphia Magazine in 1998, brought renewed attention to the family. The investigation eventually reached Philadelphia homicide detectives. And then something happened that transformed the case. Marie Noe confessed. In an extensive police interview, she admitted that she had killed some of her babies and said she could specifically remember 4 of the deaths. Investigators believed the circumstances surrounding the other deaths were similar enough to reopen the entire case. Authorities eventually charged Noe with 8 counts of murder. The revelation shocked people because the deaths had happened so many years earlier. For decades, there had been no murder case, no courtroom, no conviction, and Noe had continued living her life while the deaths remained officially unexplained. Her husband, Arthur, also reportedly continued to defend her. Even after Marie eventually admitted responsibility, Arthur maintained that he did not believe she had harmed their children. Then came the courtroom. In June 1999, Marie Noe pleaded guilty to 8 counts of second-degree murder. The plea brought an end to one of Philadelphia's most unusual cold cases. But there was another extraordinary part of the story. Marie Noe was 70 years old when she pleaded guilty. And because the crimes had occurred decades earlier, prosecutors faced enormous difficulties in trying to reconstruct the evidence. Many of the deaths had originally been treated as natural or unexplained. Physical evidence was extremely limited, and the case depended heavily on Noe's statements and the reinvestigation of records from decades earlier. Instead of sending her to prison for the rest of her life, the court accepted a controversial sentence. Noe received 20 years of probation, with the first 5 years to be served under house arrest with electronic monitoring. She was also ordered to undergo psychiatric treatment. The unusual sentence generated considerable public criticism. How could someone who admitted killing 8 children avoid a conventional prison sentence? Prosecutors argued that the age of the case and Noe's advanced age made prosecution extraordinarily difficult. They also wanted psychiatric experts to study her in the hope of understanding why a mother would repeatedly kill her own babies. The case became important not only as a criminal investigation, but also as part of a broader discussion about unexplained infant deaths and the need to reconsider repeated deaths within one family. Before the Noe investigation was reopened, the deaths had been viewed through the medical explanations available at the time. But investigators increasingly recognized that repeated unexplained infant deaths within one family could require much closer scrutiny. Noe's case helped reinforce that warning. There was also another mystery surrounding Marie herself. Why? Why would a mother repeatedly harm her own children? During her police questioning, she reportedly struggled to explain her actions. Investigators and psychiatrists considered several possible explanations, including serious mental health problems. But the precise psychological reason behind the killings was never reduced to one simple answer. And that is part of what makes this case so disturbing. There was no single dramatic moment when everything suddenly became clear. Instead, the truth emerged slowly, after years of uncertainty, decades of silence, and an investigation that forced authorities to look again at deaths everyone thought they already understood. Marie Noe's case eventually became a warning about the dangers of assuming that repeated tragedies are simply coincidences. 8 babies had died. For decades, those deaths were treated as separate tragedies. Eventually, investigators saw something different, a pattern. And once that pattern was recognized, the story of Marie Noe changed forever. She was no longer remembered simply as a mother who had lost 8 children. She became a woman who had admitted responsibility for their deaths. And her case remains one of the most disturbing examples of a decades-old family tragedy eventually being transformed into a murder investigation. 8 children, nearly 20 years, decades of unanswered questions, and finally, a confession that changed everything. This was the case of Marie Noe, and this is only number 10. The stories ahead become even more disturbing. 9. Andrea Yates. On the morning of June 20th, 2001, a mother in Houston, Texas, was alone at home with her 5 children. Her husband had left for work. The family had been struggling for years, but the problems inside the house were not simply financial or ordinary family difficulties. Andrea Yates was suffering from severe mental illness, and that morning, something happened that would shock the United States and eventually lead to one of the most controversial insanity trials in American history. Andrea Pia Yates was born in Houston in 1964. She was an intelligent and accomplished student who eventually became a nurse. In 1993, she married Rusty Yates. The couple eventually had 5 children: Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary. Noah was the oldest, followed by John, Paul, Luke, and finally Mary, who was born in late 2000. For several years, Andrea's mental health had been deteriorating. After having children, she experienced serious psychiatric problems. She suffered from severe depression and psychosis, was hospitalized multiple times, and had previously attempted suicide. Her family and doctors were increasingly concerned. The birth of her 5th child made her condition even more serious. According to evidence later presented in court, Andrea developed increasingly extreme religious beliefs. She became convinced that Satan was influencing her and that she was failing as a mother. Her behavior became so concerning that she was hospitalized for psychiatric treatment. But after she returned home, her condition continued to deteriorate. Doctors had prescribed psychiatric medication and warned the family about the seriousness of her illness. There were also concerns about leaving her alone with the children. Yet on June 20th, 2001, Andrea was at home with all 5 children. The children were Noah, 7, John, 5, Paul, 3, Luke, 2, and Mary, 6 months old. What happened next became the central fact of the entire case. Andrea killed all 5 of her children. The details are disturbing, but there is no need to describe them graphically. What matters for understanding the case is what happened afterward. Andrea contacted authorities and confessed. There was therefore never much question about whether she had caused the children's deaths. The central question became, why did she do it? And more importantly, was she legally responsible for her actions? Investigators soon discovered the extent of Andrea's psychiatric history. Her defense attorneys argued that she had been suffering from severe postpartum psychosis and was experiencing delusions when she killed her children. According to the defense, Andrea believed that her children were in danger of eternal punishment and that she was somehow protecting them. The prosecution did not deny that she was mentally ill. Instead, prosecutors argued that mental illness did not automatically mean legal insanity. Under Texas law, the insanity defense depended on whether the defendant understood the difference between right and wrong at the time of the crime. That distinction would become crucial. The first trial began in 2002. Prosecutors sought the death penalty. Andrea's lawyers presented psychiatric evidence arguing that she was legally insane. Several mental health experts testified for the defense. The prosecution relied heavily on forensic psychiatrist Park Yates. Yates testified that Andrea understood what she was doing and knew that killing her children was wrong. But Yates made a major mistake during his testimony. He claimed that an episode of the television program Law and Order had previously featured a woman who drowned her children and was found not guilty by reason of insanity. The problem was that the episode he described did not actually exist. The false testimony became extremely important because the defense argued that it could have influenced the jury. Despite the insanity defense, Andrea was convicted of capital murder in 2002. She received a life sentence rather than the death penalty. But the legal battle was not over. Andrea's attorneys appealed the conviction. In 2005, the Texas Court of Appeals overturned the conviction, concluding that Yates' erroneous testimony could have affected the jury's decision. That meant Andrea Yates would receive a new trial, and the second trial would produce a completely different outcome. In 2006, Andrea was tried again. Once again, the defense presented extensive evidence about her psychiatric condition. The prosecution continued to argue that she understood that killing her children was wrong. The second trial therefore focused heavily on the difference between being mentally ill and being legally insane. Those two concepts are not automatically the same. A person can suffer from serious mental illness and still be considered legally responsible for a crime. The jury had to decide what Andrea's mental state had been on the day her children died. After several days of deliberation, the jury reached its decision. On July 26, 2006, Andrea Yates was found not guilty by reason of insanity. She was not released. Instead, she was committed to a state psychiatric hospital for treatment and remained subject to the state's mental health system. The verdict immediately generated enormous public discussion. Some people were furious that Andrea had not been convicted of murder in the second trial. Others believed the verdict accurately reflected the evidence about her mental state. Mental health advocates also pointed to the case as an example of how serious postpartum psychiatric disorders could become when they were not adequately recognized or treated. The case changed the national conversation about postpartum depression and, more broadly, postpartum psychosis. But it is important to make one distinction clear. Andrea Yates' case does not mean that mothers experiencing postpartum depression or other mental health problems are likely to hurt their children. The overwhelming majority of people experiencing mental health difficulties are not violent. What made the Yates case extraordinary was the severity of her documented psychiatric illness and the legal question of whether that illness prevented her from understanding the wrongfulness of her actions. For the Yates family, however, there was no legal argument that could undo the tragedy. 5 children were gone: Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary. The case left behind a complicated legacy. To some, Andrea Yates became a symbol of a mother who committed an unimaginable crime. To others, she became a symbol of severe mental illness and the failures that can occur when warning signs are not adequately addressed. And to the legal system, her case became an important example of just how difficult it can be to determine criminal responsibility when mental illness and violence intersect. Andrea Yates remains committed to psychiatric care, and her case continues to be studied in discussions about criminal law, mental illness, and postpartum psychiatric disorders. But there is another important part of this series. Andrea Yates' case involved a mother whose mental illness became central to her defense. The next case is very different. There, investigators would initially hear a story about a desperate mother whose two young sons had supposedly been taken from her by a mysterious stranger. But as investigators examined the evidence, her story began to fall apart. The mother was Susan Smith, and her case would become one of the most infamous child murder investigations in American history. That is number 8. On October 25, 1994, Susan Smith arrived at the Union Police Department in Union, South Carolina, with a story that immediately captured national attention. Her two young sons were missing. 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alex had supposedly been inside Smith's car when a stranger approached her at a traffic light, forced her out of the vehicle, and drove away with the children still inside. It was the beginning of a case that would dominate American television news. For 9 days, Susan Smith publicly pleaded for the safe return of her boys, but investigators would eventually discover that the kidnapping story was false, and the truth was far more devastating. Susan Lee Smith was born in Union, South Carolina, in 1971. She married David Smith in 1991, and the couple eventually had 2 sons. Their marriage became troubled, and they separated. Susan began another relationship with a wealthy local businessman named Tom Findley. According to evidence presented later in court, Findley did not want children. Smith reportedly believed that her relationship with him might end unless she somehow changed her circumstances. On the evening of October 25th, Smith was driving her Mazda Protege with Michael and Alex inside. Later that night, she went to the police. Her story was simple. She said she had stopped at a traffic light and that a man had approached her car. According to Smith, the man forced her out and drove away. The story immediately triggered a massive search. Police officers searched roads and surrounding areas. Volunteers joined the effort. The boys' photographs appeared across newspapers and television broadcasts. Their mother appeared before cameras, asking for their safe return. She spoke about how much she wanted her children back. The case generated enormous sympathy. But investigators were not simply accepting the kidnapping story. They were examining the evidence. And slowly, inconsistencies began appearing. One of the most important problems involved Smith's description of the alleged carjacker. Investigators questioned her repeatedly about the supposed kidnapping. The more they examined the story, the more difficult it became to reconcile her account with the physical evidence. Police eventually determined that there was no convincing evidence that a stranger had stolen the vehicle. The investigation began turning toward Susan herself. On November 3, 1994, 9 days after the disappearance, Smith finally admitted that the kidnapping story had been fabricated. She told investigators that she had driven her car into a lake with her 2 sons inside. The confession stunned the country. The mother, who had spent 9 days asking the public to help find her children, had actually known what had happened to them. Investigators recovered the vehicle from John D. Longlake. Both children were found inside. The discovery ended the search but began an even more difficult stage of the case, determining why Susan Smith had killed her sons. The prosecution argued that Smith had killed the children because she wanted to pursue her relationship with Tom Findley. The defense offered a more complicated picture. Her attorneys presented evidence about Smith's troubled psychological history and argued that she was suffering from serious emotional problems. But the central fact remained undisputed. Smith had intentionally caused the deaths of her 2 children. In July 1995, Susan Smith went on trial for murder. The prosecution presented evidence showing that her kidnapping story had been fabricated. They also introduced her relationship with Findley and argued that Smith had wanted a life without the responsibilities associated with her children. The defense challenged that interpretation and attempted to show that Smith's mental state was more complicated than the prosecution suggested. The jury ultimately found Susan Smith guilty of 2 counts of murder. However, she was not sentenced to death. She received life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 30 years. The case created an enormous public reaction. Many people had initially viewed Smith as a grieving mother whose children had been taken from her. When the truth emerged, that sympathy turned into anger. The case also generated debate about media coverage. For 9 days, millions of people followed the search for Michael and Alex. News organizations repeatedly showed photographs of the children and their mother. The eventual revelation that the kidnapping had never happened demonstrated just how difficult it can be for investigators and the public to distinguish between a genuine disappearance and a carefully constructed deception. There was another disturbing dimension to the case. Smith's relationship with Findlay became a major part of the prosecution's explanation for the murders. But Findlay later rejected the idea that he had encouraged Smith to kill her children. The case, therefore, left investigators, journalists, and the public debating exactly what motivated her. Was it primarily her relationship? Was it her psychological state? Was it a combination of personal problems and emotional instability? There was no single explanation that completely resolved the case. What is certain is that 2 children lost their lives, and their mother initially tried to convince an entire community that an unknown criminal was responsible. The case also became a reminder that a person's public behavior after a crime does not necessarily reveal what happened behind closed doors. For 9 days, Susan Smith appeared to be a desperate mother searching for her children. Behind that story was a very different reality. Michael was only 3 years old. Alex was 14 months old. Neither child had any understanding of the conflict surrounding their mother's life. And their deaths permanently changed the lives of everyone connected to the case. Susan Smith remains incarcerated. The case continues to be remembered not only because of the murders themselves, but because of the elaborate false story that followed. A mother claimed that a stranger had taken her children. Police, volunteers, and the public searched for that stranger. And then, after 9 days, the mother herself revealed the truth. But Susan Smith is only number 8. The next case takes us back to New York, where investigators confronted something even more difficult to comprehend. A mother whose children repeatedly died in infancy, one after another, until authorities finally began to suspect that the deaths were not natural. Her name was Waneta Hoyt. For years, the deaths of Waneta Hoyt's children were regarded as a terrible medical mystery. 5 babies, 5 deaths, and each time the explanation seemed to be the same: sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS. There was no murder investigation, no arrest, no courtroom, and no reason for the public to believe that the grieving mother herself was responsible. But more than 2 decades after the last child died, investigators reopened the case. What they discovered would transform a story of unexplained infant deaths into one of the most disturbing maternal murder cases in American history. This is the story of Waneta Hoyt. Waneta was born in 1946 in Richford, New York. She married Tim Hoyt in 1964, and together they began a family. Their first biological child, Eric, was born in October 1964. But Eric's life lasted only a few months. He died in January 1965. At the time, there was no murder investigation. The death was considered unexplained and was attributed to SIDS. Then, more than a year later, another child was born. His name was James. James died in September 1968, and the family experienced another devastating loss that same year. A daughter named Julie was born in July 1968. She died only weeks later. 3 children were now dead. But there was still no criminal investigation. Then came Molly, born in 1970. She also died as an infant. And finally, in 1971, Waneta gave birth to Noah. He too died before reaching his 2nd birthday. Between 1965 and 1971, all 5 of Waneta Hoyt's biological children had died. None was older than 27 months. The pattern was extraordinary. Yet the deaths were initially interpreted through the medical understanding of the time. SIDS was poorly understood, and unexplained infant deaths were extremely difficult to investigate. The Hoyt children's deaths even became part of medical research. Pediatrician Alfred Steinschneider studied the deaths of Molly and Noah and published a 1972 paper proposing a connection between sleep apnea and SIDS. The deaths were therefore not simply forgotten. They became part of a scientific discussion about why apparently healthy babies could die unexpectedly. And that would become extremely important years later, because the very medical research that helped explain the children's deaths eventually helped bring investigators back to the family. For more than 20 years, Waneta and her husband continued their lives. They eventually adopted a son, but questions about the 5 deaths remained buried in old medical records. Then, in 1992, a prosecutor named Owen Fitzpatrick came across information about the Hoyt children's deaths while investigating another case. Something about the pattern caught his attention. 5 children from the same family had died under circumstances that appeared remarkably similar. The old medical explanation suddenly deserved another look. Investigators began reviewing the records. They examined the circumstances surrounding each death. They looked at medical information and autopsy records. And according to prosecutors, the deaths had one striking feature. The children had died while they were under their mother's exclusive care. The case was reopened. But there was a major problem. More than 20 years had passed since the last death. The children were long buried. Physical evidence was extremely limited. Investigators therefore had to rely heavily on old records, medical testimony, and whatever information could be recovered from the people who had been involved. Then came the interrogation that changed everything. In March 1994, state police questioned Waneta. According to investigators, they initially presented the conversation as being connected to research into SIDS. The questioning continued for nearly 2 hours. Eventually, police confronted her with their suspicions, and Waneta confessed. According to her statement, she had caused the deaths of all 5 children. She said she had been unable to tolerate their crying. Her confession described a pattern in which she deliberately caused the children to stop breathing. The confession shocked investigators. After more than 2 decades of believing that the deaths had been medical tragedies, they now had a mother admitting responsibility. Waneta was arrested and charged with murder. But the case was far from over, because Waneta later recanted her confession. She claimed that police had manipulated and pressured her into saying things that were not true. Her defense attorneys argued that the confession was unreliable. They pointed out that investigators had used deception during the interrogation and argued that Waneta was psychologically vulnerable. This became one of the central issues of the trial. The prosecution had her confession, but the defense argued that a confession alone should not be enough when the circumstances surrounding it were disputed. Medical experts also disagreed. Forensic pathologist Michael Baden examined the case and supported the prosecution's conclusion that the children's deaths were not natural, but the original medical researcher, Alfred Steinschneider, continued to believe that SIDS was responsible for the deaths. He testified for the defense. The disagreement was extraordinary. One side argued that 5 children had been murdered. The other maintained that the children had suffered from a medical condition that doctors still struggled to understand. The trial, therefore, became more than a murder case. It became a battle over evidence, medical science, and the reliability of a confession made decades after the deaths. In April 1995, after a trial lasting several weeks, the jury reached its verdict. Waneta Hoyt was found guilty of murdering all 5 of her children. She was sentenced to 75 years to life in prison, with 15 years imposed for each murder. But even after her conviction, the controversy did not disappear. The case raised difficult questions about how investigators should approach repeated infant deaths. SIDS was real. Thousands of infants had died from unexplained causes. Most parents who lost babies were innocent families experiencing unimaginable grief. But the Hoyt case demonstrated that investigators could not simply assume that every unexplained infant death was natural. It also demonstrated how dramatically medical conclusions could change as new evidence emerged. For Waneta Hoyt herself, the story ended in prison. She continued to maintain that her confession had been obtained unfairly and that she had not killed her children. But the conviction remained. In 1998, while serving her sentence, Hoyt died from pancreatic cancer at the age of 52. She had spent only a few years in prison after her conviction. Her case remains controversial because of the disputed confession and the medical debate surrounding the children's original diagnoses. But the most haunting part of the story is the timeline. 5 children died between 1965 and 1971. For more than 2 decades, their deaths were treated as separate medical tragedies. Then, in the 1990s, investigators looked backward, and suddenly, the deaths appeared to form a pattern. 5 children, 1 mother, 1 family, and a mystery that had remained hidden for more than 20 years. Waneta Hoyt's case showed just how difficult it can be to recognize a crime when it initially looks like a medical tragedy. And it left behind a question that investigators could not escape. What if the first explanation for a child's death is wrong? But Waneta Hoyt is only number 7. Next, we move to a mother whose case became notorious for an entirely different reason. Her children did not all die in infancy. Instead, investigators would uncover a disturbing pattern surrounding a mother, her children, and a series of claims that eventually led to a murder conviction. The next case is Marybeth Tinning, and her story begins in New York. For more than a decade, one family in Schenectady, New York, experienced tragedy after tragedy. Children were born. Children became sick or suddenly died. Funerals followed. Then another child was born, and the cycle appeared to begin again. By the end, 9 children connected to Marybeth and Joseph Tinning had died before reaching the age of 5. For years, the deaths were attributed to illnesses, natural causes, unexplained conditions, or sudden infant death syndrome. But in 1985, after the death of the couple's 9th child, an anonymous phone call finally forced authorities to ask a question that should have been asked much earlier. How many children have to die before someone investigates? This is the story of Marybeth Tinning. Marybeth Rowe was born in 1942 and grew up in New York. She later married Joseph Tinning, who worked for General Electric. The couple began having children in the early 1970s. Their first child, Jennifer, died when she was only 8 days old in 1972. Her death was attributed to acute meningitis, and authorities did not initially consider it suspicious. But tragedy struck again. 2 more children died within a short period. One was Joseph, who was about 2 years old. Another was Barbara, who was 4. Their deaths were initially explained as medical emergencies, including seizures and cardiac problems. Investigators looked into at least one of the deaths, but no criminal charges followed. Then another baby died in 1973. This time, the death was attributed to SIDS. In 1975, another son, Timothy, died at 5 months old. His death was attributed after an autopsy to acute pulmonary edema. 4 years later, another daughter, Mary Frances, died after suffering serious medical problems as an infant. Then came Jonathan. He died in 1980 after spending weeks on life support. By this point, the pattern was becoming difficult to ignore. But there was another extraordinary detail. One of the children who died, Michael, was not biologically related to Marybeth. He was an adopted child. Michael died in 1981 after previously suffering a head injury. His death was attributed to bronchial pneumonia. The fact that an adopted child had also died meant that the idea of a hereditary condition affecting only the Tinning biological children became much harder to sustain. Yet still, no murder charges were brought. Doctors and investigators had questions, but the deaths continued to be treated individually. Then came the 9th child. Her name was Tammy Lynn. She was born on August 22, 1985. She was only 4 months old when she died on December 20, 1985. At first, her death was again treated as a medical tragedy. But this time, something was different. An anonymous caller contacted authorities. The caller reportedly asked, "How many more have to die before you do something?" That phone call helped trigger a much deeper investigation. Police began reviewing the deaths of the Tinning children. Investigators examined medical records, autopsy reports, and the circumstances surrounding each death. They discovered that 8 children had died over roughly 14 years. The causes varied. Some had been classified as natural. Others were unexplained. Some were attributed to SIDS. But the sheer number of deaths was extraordinary. Investigators began concentrating on Tammy Lynn. Forensic pathologists concluded that her death was not consistent with the natural explanation originally given. The investigation eventually focused on the possibility that she had been deliberately suffocated. Marybeth Tinning was questioned by New York State Police in February 1986. During that interrogation, she made statements that would become the foundation of the prosecution's case. According to police, she admitted that she had killed Tammy Lynn. She also made statements implicating herself in the deaths of 2 other children, Timothy and Nathan. The explanation she reportedly gave was chillingly simple. She said the children were crying or making noises, and she wanted them to stop. But Marybeth later disputed the confession. She claimed that police had pressured and threatened her during questioning. Her attorneys argued that the confession should not be trusted. The defense also suggested that Tammy Lynn might have suffered from a rare inherited neurological condition known as Wernicke-Hoffmann disease. Prosecutors disagreed. Medical experts testified that Tammy Lynn had been deliberately suffocated. The case went to trial in 1987. The prosecution did not need to prove that Marybeth had killed all 9 children. The charge before the jury concerned Tammy Lynn. The other deaths were important because they helped establish the unusual history surrounding the family, but Marybeth was not convicted of murdering all of them. The trial lasted several weeks. The jury examined the evidence, including Marybeth's statements to investigators. After deliberating, the jury reached its verdict. On July 17, 1987, Marybeth Tinning was convicted of second-degree murder in the death of Tammy Lynn. She was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison, but the conviction did not end the controversy. Marybeth continued to deny killing Tammy Lynn. Authorities continued to regard several of the other children's deaths as suspicious, but she was never convicted of those additional deaths. That distinction is important. Marybeth Tinning is a convicted murderer in the death of Tammy Lynn. She is widely described as being suspected of involvement in the deaths of other children, but those additional deaths did not result in murder convictions. Over the years, different theories emerged about what might have motivated her. Some experts speculated about psychological disorders involving attention and illness, including what was historically called Munchausen syndrome by proxy. But there was never a definitive public diagnosis that completely explained her behavior, and the question of motive remained complicated. In 2011, during a later parole hearing, Tinning reportedly gave a different account of what had happened. She acknowledged responsibility for Tammy Lynn's death and described herself as psychologically damaged after the earlier deaths of her children. That statement was a significant change from her earlier insistence that she was innocent. Marybeth remained imprisoned for decades. She was denied parole multiple times. Then, in 2018, after her 7th parole hearing, she was finally granted release. She was 75 years old. She had served approximately 31 years in prison for Tammy Lynn's murder. The case had left behind difficult questions for investigators and medical professionals. How could so many children from one family die without a more coordinated investigation? Why weren't the records of the deaths immediately connected? And how did the family continue to receive medical attention without the pattern becoming a decisive warning sign? In hindsight, the number of deaths was extraordinary. But at the time, doctors were dealing with conditions that were often poorly understood. There was also no single central system that automatically connected every suspicious or unexplained child death. The Tinning case became an example of why communication between doctors, medical examiners, police, and social services can matter enormously when repeated tragedies occur within the same family. For years, each death had been viewed almost as an individual tragedy. It was only when investigators finally stepped back and looked at the entire history that the pattern became impossible to ignore. 9 children, 14 years, 1 family, and only 1 murder conviction. Marybeth Tinning's story remains disturbing not simply because of the crime for which she was convicted, but because of the unanswered questions surrounding the other deaths. The case reminds us that an accusation is not the same thing as a conviction, and that distinction matters when telling a true crime story. But this is only number 6. Our next case takes us to Oregon, where another mother became the center of a notorious investigation after her children were found suffering from gunshot wounds. Unlike Marybeth Tinning's case, there was no decades-long mystery. The surviving children were able to tell investigators what happened, and their mother's explanation would become one of the most controversial parts of the case. Her name was Diane Downs, and that is the story we turn to next. On the night of May 19, 1983, a woman drove into the emergency department at McKenzie-Willamette Hospital in Springfield, Oregon. Her name was Diane Downs. Inside her car were her 3 children. 7-year-old Cheryl was critically wounded. 8-year-old Christy and 3-year-old Danny were also seriously injured. Diane told hospital staff that a stranger had attacked them on a rural road. According to her story, a man had tried to steal her car and then shot her children. But within hours, investigators began questioning whether the story was true. And what followed became one of America's most notorious cases involving a mother and her children. Diane Elizabeth Downs was born in 1955 and grew up in Phoenix, Arizona. She married Steve Downs in 1973. The couple eventually had 3 children, Christy, Cheryl, and Danny. Their marriage eventually broke down, and Steve left Diane in 1980. Diane later moved to Oregon. She worked for the U.S. Postal Service and was raising her children while also pursuing relationships outside her marriage. One relationship would later become central to the prosecution's explanation for what happened. Diane had become involved with a married man, Robert Knickerbocker. According to prosecutors, Knickerbocker did not want children. They argued that Diane wanted a relationship with him and believed her children were standing in the way. That became one of the major questions surrounding the case. Did Diane want a new life badly enough to eliminate the people she believed were preventing it? On May 19, 1983, Diane was driving with her 3 children when the shooting occurred. She eventually arrived at the hospital claiming a stranger had attacked them. 7-year-old Cheryl died from her injuries. Christy and Danny survived, but both suffered serious, lasting consequences. Diane herself had a relatively minor gunshot wound to her arm. The hospital staff immediately concentrated on saving the children, but some staff members noticed something unusual about Diane's behavior. According to later testimony, she appeared remarkably calm considering what she claimed had just happened. Her explanation also raised questions. Investigators examined the physical evidence and began comparing it with her account. The alleged attacker was never found. And as detectives questioned Diane, parts of her story changed. The case became increasingly focused on her. But investigators needed evidence that could stand up in court. One of the most important developments came from Christy. Because of the injuries she had suffered, Christy initially had difficulty communicating what had happened. Months of medical treatment and therapy followed. Eventually, she was able to speak clearly enough to tell investigators what she remembered. Her account contradicted her mother's story. Christy said that her mother was responsible for the shooting. That testimony would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the prosecution's case. Investigators also examined Diane's personal writings. Prosecutors argued that some of her diary entries revealed an intense preoccupation with the man she was dating and suggested that she wanted a life without the responsibilities of raising her children. The prosecution's theory was that Diane had deliberately attacked her children because she believed they interfered with the relationship she wanted. Diane rejected that accusation. She continued to insist that an unknown man had attacked the family. But the investigation continued. On February 28, 1984, approximately 9 months after the shootings, Diane Downs was arrested. She was charged with the murder of Cheryl and the attempted murders and assaults of Christy and Danny. There was another remarkable development. At the time she went on trial, Diane was pregnant. She had become pregnant after the shootings, and while the trial was underway, she gave birth to another daughter. The baby was named Amy Elizabeth. The state eventually placed the child for adoption, and she was later renamed Rebecca Babcock. Meanwhile, Diane's trial was attracting national attention. The prosecution presented evidence intended to show that the supposed carjacking was a fabrication. They relied on physical evidence, Diane's changing statements, her writings, and the testimony of her surviving daughter. Christy eventually took the witness stand. She was still a child, but her testimony was devastating to the defense. When asked who had shot her and her siblings, Christy identified her mother. That testimony helped prosecutors establish that Diane's account of a mysterious attacker could not be trusted. The defense continued to maintain that Diane was innocent. But after lengthy deliberations, the jury reached its decision in June 1984. Diane Downs was found guilty of murder, attempted murder, and assault in connection with the attack on her 3 children. She was sentenced to life in prison plus 50 years, with the additional sentences ordered consecutively. The story did not end there. In 1987, Diane escaped from an Oregon prison. She climbed over a fence and remained free for approximately 11 days before being captured. She later pleaded guilty to the escape charge and received additional punishment. Her surviving children, meanwhile, were placed in a new home. Christy and Danny were eventually adopted by prosecutor Fred Hughey, who had prosecuted their mother and his wife. They largely remained away from the public spotlight afterward. Danny suffered permanent physical consequences from his injuries. Christy also faced lasting effects from the attack, but both eventually built private lives away from the case that had defined their childhoods. Diane continued to maintain her innocence for decades, despite her conviction. She has pursued legal challenges and has repeatedly sought parole, but she remains incarcerated. Recent reporting indicates that she continues to contest aspects of her conviction. The Diane Downs case became infamous for several reasons. There was the death of 7-year-old Cheryl. There were the injuries suffered by Christy and Danny. There was the mysterious attacker who, according to Diane's original story, had supposedly appeared on a dark rural road. And then there was the testimony of a surviving child that directly contradicted that story. But perhaps the most disturbing part of the case was the transformation of the story itself. At first, Diane appeared to be a mother searching for an explanation for why her children had been attacked. Then, investigators began asking questions. The supposed stranger could not be found. The evidence did not fit the story. And eventually, her own daughter became a key witness against her. 3 children had been placed in terrible danger. One of them, Cheryl, did not survive, and 2 others had to grow up carrying the consequences of what happened that night. Diane Downs was convicted because the jury concluded that she, not the mysterious stranger she described, was responsible. Her case remains one of the most controversial maternal crime cases in American history. But Diane Downs is only number 5. Next, we leave Oregon and travel to Australia. The next case involves a mother whose infant daughter disappeared, and whose story remained a mystery for years before a courtroom eventually reached a verdict. The mother's name was Keli Lane, and her story is next. Diane Downs was convicted after investigators rejected her story about a mysterious attacker, and her surviving daughter became a crucial witness. But the next case is very different. There was no recovered body. There was no eyewitness to the killing. And for years, one question remained unanswered. Where was the baby? Her name was Tegan Lane, and the person eventually convicted of killing her was her own mother, Keli Lane. Keli Lane was born in Australia in 1975. She became a successful swimmer and competed at a high level, including representing Australia in international competition. But while she was pursuing her sporting career, Lane was also living a complicated personal life. In 1996, she gave birth to a daughter named Tegan. Tegan was born on August 15, 1996, in Sydney. But almost immediately, Lane's story about what happened to her daughter became difficult for investigators to establish. Lane later claimed that Tegan had been given to a man named Andrew Norris, whom she described as the baby's father. According to Lane, Norris had taken responsibility for the child. The problem was that investigators could not find him, and more importantly, they could not find Tegan. Years passed. There was no reliable evidence that Tegan had been raised by another family. There was no confirmed adoption record. There was no school record. There was no medical history that could establish where the child had gone. And eventually, investigators began asking the question they had been avoiding. Had Tegan ever left her mother's care alive? The case became even more complicated because Lane had given birth to other children. Investigators examined her history and discovered inconsistencies in her accounts of her pregnancies and children. The disappearance of Tegan had remained hidden for years, partly because Lane had not immediately reported her daughter missing. That became extremely important. If a child disappeared, investigators would normally expect a missing person report, family members searching, medical records, school records, and other documentation. But Tegan seemed to vanish without leaving the ordinary trail that children leave behind. Eventually, police began investigating Lane. Their investigation focused heavily on her claims about Tegan's father. Who was Andrew Norris? Did he actually exist? Could he be located? And if he had taken Tegan, where was the child? Investigators eventually determined that Lane's story about Norris could not be substantiated. The man she claimed had taken Tegan could not be found in the way she described. There was also no evidence that Tegan had been living with him. The case remained a mystery because authorities had one enormous problem. There was no body. Without a body, prosecutors would have to prove that Tegan had died and that Lane was responsible. That is an extremely difficult task, but prosecutors argued that the circumstances surrounding Tegan's disappearance were overwhelming. They said Lane had repeatedly lied about the child. They argued that her accounts changed over time, and they presented evidence suggesting that she had concealed the pregnancy and birth from people around her. The prosecution eventually charged Lane with Tegan's murder. The trial began in Sydney in 2010. The case attracted enormous attention because of the missing body. Lane maintained that Tegan had been given to another man and insisted that she had not killed her daughter. Her defense argued that the prosecution could not prove exactly what had happened to Tegan. But prosecutors presented a circumstantial case. They argued that Lane had the opportunity, the motive, and the means. They also highlighted the lack of any credible evidence that Tegan had ever been raised by another family. The jury had to consider whether the evidence was strong enough to establish murder beyond reasonable doubt. One of the most important issues was Lane's behavior after Tegan disappeared. Why had she not properly reported her daughter missing? Why were there no convincing records showing that Tegan had been cared for elsewhere? And why did Lane's explanation continue to change? The prosecution argued that these questions were not isolated coincidences. Together they formed a pattern. Lane's defense continued to insist that there was another explanation. But after a lengthy trial, the jury reached its decision. On December 13, 2010, Keli Lane was found guilty of murdering Tegan Lane. She was sentenced to 18 years in prison with a non-parole period of 13 years and 5 months. But even after the conviction, the case remained controversial. Tegan's body had never been found. That meant the family still had no grave. There was no final physical confirmation of exactly how the child had died, and Lane continued to maintain her innocence. The conviction therefore rested heavily on circumstantial evidence, and the conclusion that Lane's story about Tegan being taken by another man was false. Lane appealed her conviction. Her legal team argued that the evidence was insufficient and challenged aspects of the prosecution's case. The appeals were unsuccessful. Meanwhile, the mystery of Tegan's whereabouts continued to attract public attention. The case also raised difficult questions about missing children. When a child disappears, the absence of records can itself become significant. No school, no doctor, no photographs from later childhood, no confirmed relatives, no documented life after infancy. In Tegan's case, investigators found no convincing evidence that she had lived beyond infancy. For the prosecution, that absence was part of the case against Lane. For Lane's supporters, however, the missing body remained an important reason to question the conviction. The case remains one of Australia's most controversial maternal murder cases. It is also an example of how prosecutors can sometimes build a murder case without recovering a victim's body. The evidence does not always come from one dramatic discovery. Sometimes it comes from hundreds of smaller pieces, statements, records, timelines, inconsistencies, and the absence of evidence where evidence should normally exist. Tegan Lane was an infant. She had no ability to explain what happened to her, and because her body was never found, the full story of her final moments remains unknown. Keli Lane was convicted of her murder and has continued to deny responsibility. The case therefore leaves two separate questions. The first is the legal question. Was the evidence sufficient to prove Lane murdered her daughter? The jury said yes. The second is the question that has never received a complete physical answer. What actually happened to Tegan Lane? That mystery remains at the heart of the case. But Keli Lane is only number 4. Next, we return to the United States for the story of a mother whose case involved something even more extraordinary. 6 newborn babies who died, all connected to the same woman. Investigators eventually uncovered a secret that had remained hidden inside her home for years. Her name was Megan Huntsman. And that is the case we turn to next. For years, a quiet house in Pleasant Grove, Utah, held a secret that investigators would eventually describe as one of the most disturbing discoveries in the state's history. It began in April 2014, when police received an unexpected report. A newborn baby had been found inside the garage of a home. The discovery was shocking enough, but investigators soon realized that this was not an isolated incident. As they searched the property, they discovered the remains of 7 newborn babies. The person at the center of the investigation was the children's mother, Megan Huntsman. And what made the case even more difficult to comprehend was that the deaths had apparently occurred over a period of several years. Megan Huntsman was born in 1975 and lived in Utah with her husband, Darren West. The couple had children together, and Huntsman had also been pregnant multiple times during the years investigators would eventually examine. But according to prosecutors, between 1996 and 2006, Huntsman gave birth to 7 babies who did not survive. 6 of those babies were later discovered in the garage. The 7th was eventually accounted for separately. For years, however, nobody knew what had happened. The truth only began to emerge in April 2014. Huntsman's husband had been away from the home for some time and later returned after serving a prison sentence. According to reports, he was cleaning out the garage when he discovered what appeared to be the remains of a newborn. He contacted authorities. Police arrived and began investigating. Then came the discovery that transformed the case. Investigators found the remains of 6 infants. The babies had been concealed in boxes and other containers inside the garage. Authorities immediately began trying to determine who they were and how they had died. DNA testing eventually established that the infants were related to Huntsman. She was their mother. The investigation quickly became a homicide case. Huntsman was questioned by police. According to investigators, she eventually admitted that she had given birth to the babies and had caused their deaths. She told authorities that she had concealed the bodies afterward. The case raised an enormous question. How could 6 pregnancies and 6 infant deaths happen without family, friends, or authorities discovering what was happening? Huntsman's husband reportedly told investigators that he had not known about the pregnancies or the deaths. He was initially investigated because of his connection to the home, but authorities did not charge him with the murders. Instead, the evidence focused on Huntsman. Prosecutors alleged that the babies were born alive and that Huntsman deliberately killed them. The defense did not dispute that she was responsible for the deaths, but her attorneys argued that her mental state and circumstances needed to be considered. Investigators also examined Huntsman's history. She had struggled with drug addiction and other personal problems, but prosecutors argued that those circumstances did not explain away what she had done. The medical evidence became especially important. Authorities had to determine whether the babies had been born alive and whether their deaths were the result of natural causes or deliberate actions. The investigation concluded that the infants had been killed. Huntsman was charged with 6 counts of murder. The case attracted national attention because of the sheer number of victims. 6 newborn babies had been hidden in the same garage, and according to investigators, the deaths had taken place over roughly a decade. Huntsman eventually pleaded guilty to 6 counts of murder in 2015. She was sentenced to 6 consecutive terms of 2 to 15 years in prison, meaning the sentences could amount to a substantial period of incarceration. Because of the plea agreement and the sentencing structure in Utah, the legal outcome was different from what many people expected when the case first became public. The judge also ordered Huntsman to serve her sentences consecutively. The case left behind a complicated picture of a woman who had apparently managed to conceal repeated pregnancies and infant deaths for years. There were also questions about the people around her. How could nobody know? How could no one notice the pregnancies? How could 6 newborn deaths remain hidden? And why did Huntsman continue living in the same community while the secret remained concealed? The discovery forced investigators to look not only at the crimes themselves, but also at the circumstances that allowed them to remain hidden. One of the most important distinctions in this case is that not every detail surrounding the deaths was conclusively established in the same way. Huntsman's confession and the forensic investigation were central to the prosecution, but the exact circumstances surrounding each individual baby's death were not identical. That is why the case has continued to generate questions about motive and mental state. Huntsman later claimed that she had been overwhelmed by her circumstances and had not wanted the pregnancies. But prosecutors maintained that she had deliberately ended the lives of the babies after giving birth. Whatever the psychological explanation, the outcome was devastating. 6 infants who had barely entered the world were gone. Their existence had been hidden from almost everyone around them, and their remains remained in a garage for years before they were finally discovered. The case also demonstrated something important about criminal investigations. Sometimes, investigators do not begin with a murder. They begin with a discovery that makes no sense. A suspicious object, an unexplained death, a forgotten box. And then, piece by piece, the investigation reveals something much larger. That is what happened in Pleasant Grove. One discovery led to another. One infant became 6. And a hidden family secret became a murder investigation. Megan Huntsman was ultimately convicted through her guilty pleas, and she remains imprisoned. But the case continues to raise difficult questions about how repeated abuse or violence can remain hidden inside apparently ordinary communities. 6 children, nearly 10 years, 1 mother, and a secret hidden in a garage. But Megan Huntsman is only number 3. 2 children seem to simply disappear. 7-year-old Joshua J.J. Vallow and 16-year-old Tylee Ryan were no longer being seen by relatives, friends, teachers, or neighbors. Their mother, Lori Vallow, continued living her life. But as investigators began asking questions, they uncovered a chain of relationships, unusual beliefs, unexplained deaths, and secretive behavior that eventually led them to one of the most closely followed family murder cases in the United States. This is the story of Lori Vallow. Lori Noreen Cox was born in California in 1973 and later became Lori Vallow Daybell. She had been married several times and had children from previous relationships. Her daughter, Tylee Ryan, was born in 2002. Later, Lori adopted Joshua J.J. Vallow, who was born in 2012. JJ had autism and required special care. For a period of time, Lori lived with her children in Arizona. But her life changed dramatically after she met Chad Daybell. Chad was a religious writer who had developed unusual beliefs about life, death, and spiritual identities. Lori became increasingly involved with him. The relationship would eventually become central to the entire investigation. There was another major complication. Lori was already married to Charles Vallow. Charles became increasingly concerned about Lori's behavior and her beliefs. The marriage deteriorated. In January 2019, Charles filed for divorce, expressing concerns about Lori's mental state and behavior. But before the divorce could be completed, Charles was killed. On July 11, 2019, Charles went to Lori's home in Chandler, Arizona. An argument developed between Charles and Lori's brother, Alex Cox. Cox later claimed that Charles attacked him and that he acted in self-defense. Charles was shot and killed. At the time, authorities did not charge Cox with murder. The death was initially treated as a self-defense shooting, But later developments would cause investigators to reconsider the circumstances surrounding Charles's death. After Charles died, Lori and her children eventually moved to Idaho. There, Lori's relationship with Chad Daybell became even more significant. The two eventually married. But there was a serious problem. JJ and Tylee were disappearing from the lives of the people who knew them. Tylee was last seen in September 2019. She had accompanied her family on a trip to Yellowstone National Park. A photograph from that trip would later become one of the last confirmed images of her alive. JJ was last seen alive on September 22, 2019. After that, family members became increasingly concerned. JJ's grandparents repeatedly tried to determine where he was, but Lori provided explanations that investigators eventually found suspicious. She claimed JJ was safe. She suggested that he was staying with friends or that there were other explanations for why people could not see him. Eventually, police became involved. On November 26, 2019, authorities conducted a welfare check at Lori's home. JJ was not there. Tylee was not there either. Lori was unable to provide a satisfactory explanation for their whereabouts. Investigators soon discovered something else. The children had essentially vanished without leaving the normal trail of evidence that would be expected if they were alive. There were no credible school records, no convincing medical appointments, no reliable photographs showing them after the dates when investigators believed they had disappeared. And then came another disturbing discovery. Investigators began examining the deaths of people connected to Lori and Chad. One of those people was Tammy Daybell, Chad's wife. Tammy died suddenly in October 2019. Her death was initially considered natural, but after investigators began examining the broader circumstances surrounding Lori and Chad, Tammy's death was eventually reclassified as suspicious. In 2020, authorities exhumed her body. The investigation expanded. Then, in June 2020, police searching property belonging to Chad Daybell made the discovery that changed everything. They found human remains. The remains were later identified as J.J. Vallow and Tylee Ryan. The children who had been missing for months were dead. The investigation now became a homicide case. Lori and Chad were both charged in connection with the children's deaths. Prosecutors alleged that religious beliefs and personal relationships had played a role in the killings. The prosecution argued that Lori and Chad had developed beliefs in which certain people were considered spiritually dangerous or effectively dark. Those beliefs became an important part of the prosecution's explanation of the crimes. But the evidence was not limited to ideology. Investigators also examined phone records, financial information, movements, relationships, and the deaths of people connected to the couple. The case eventually involved 3 major deaths: Tylee Ryan, Joshua Vallow, and Tammy Daybell. Lori's brother, Alex Cox, had also died in December 2019. His death was initially attributed to natural causes, but investigators later determined that he had died from natural causes and did not charge him posthumously. The case moved forward. Lori Vallow was eventually prosecuted for the murders of her children and for conspiracy relating to Tammy Daybell's death. Her trial began in Idaho in 2023. Prosecutors presented evidence about the children's disappearance, the discoveries on Chad's property, Lori's relationship with Chad, and the deaths surrounding them. The defense attempted to challenge the prosecution's interpretation of events. But after a lengthy trial, the jury reached its verdict. On May 12, 2023, Lori Vallow was found guilty on all counts, including the murders of Tylee and JJ and conspiracy in the death of Tammy Daybell. She was later sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Chad Daybell was tried separately. In 2024, he was convicted of murdering Tylee, JJ, and Tammy and received the death penalty. The case left the public with difficult questions. How could 2 children disappear for months while their mother continued living normally? Why did several deaths connected to the family occur within such a short period? And how did Lori's relationship with Chad become intertwined with the fate of her children? But perhaps the most heartbreaking part of the case is that JJ and Tylee had people searching for them. Their grandparents wanted answers. Their relatives wanted to know where they were. And yet for months, the truth remained hidden. The investigation eventually exposed what had happened. The children's bodies were found. Their mother was convicted, and the mystery surrounding their disappearance became a murder case that stretched across multiple states. Lori Vallow's case is also a reminder that a conviction should be separated from speculation. The jury determined that Lori was criminally responsible for the deaths and related conspiracy. Her convictions established her legal responsibility. But questions about precisely what motivated every decision remain subjects of continued discussion. Two children who should have had decades ahead of them instead became the center of one of America's most disturbing family murder investigations. J.J. Vallow was 7. Tylee Ryan was 16. Their disappearance began as a missing person investigation. It ended with their mother convicted of murder. And now we reach the final case in our countdown. The last story takes us back to New York, and to a mother whose name became synonymous with one of the most shocking child murder cases in American history. This is number 1. We have been following stories of mothers whose children died under very different circumstances. Some cases involved years of unexplained deaths. Others involved deception, missing children, or mental illness. But our final case is different. Because although a mother was convicted and sentenced to death for killing her 5-year-old son, she has continued to maintain that she was innocent. And decades later, the case remains controversial. Her name is Darlie Routier. On the night of June 6, 1996, Darlie Routier was at her home in Rolette, Texas, with her 3 sons. Her husband, Darren, was upstairs with their infant son, Drake. Darlie was downstairs with her 2 older boys, 6-year-old Devin and 5-year-old Damon. Then, shortly after 2:30 in the morning, Darlie called 911. She reported that someone had broken into the house and attacked her and her children. When emergency responders arrived, Devin and Damon were critically injured. Darlie was also injured. The boys did not survive. The investigation immediately became a murder case. At first, Darlie's account was that an unknown intruder had entered the house. She described a stranger fleeing through the garage. But investigators quickly began questioning that explanation. They examined the house and the surrounding area. They looked at the evidence and tried to determine whether an outside attacker had actually entered the home. According to prosecutors, the physical evidence did not fit Darlie's account. They argued that the crime scene had been staged to make it appear as though an intruder was responsible. Darlie strongly disagreed. She maintained that an intruder had attacked her family. That disagreement would become the central issue of the trial. The prosecution also argued that Darlie's injuries were self-inflicted and that she had attempted to make investigators believe she had been attacked alongside her children. The defense rejected that interpretation. They argued that the evidence did not conclusively prove Darlie had killed her sons. The case attracted enormous attention. The image of a mother losing 2 children in a single night was difficult for the public to comprehend. And then the investigation took an even more controversial turn. Darlie was arrested on June 18, 1996, just 12 days after the killings. She was charged with capital murder. The trial began in January 1997. Because of the enormous publicity surrounding the case, the trial was moved from Dallas County to Kerrville, Texas. Prosecutors presented Darlie as the person responsible for the deaths. They argued that financial pressures and problems within the family had contributed to her motive. The defense argued that there was no convincing reason for a mother to kill her children and insisted that an unknown intruder had committed the crime. There was also no confession. There was no eyewitness who saw Darlie kill her children. Instead, the prosecution relied heavily on forensic evidence and its interpretation of the crime scene. The trial lasted almost 5 weeks. On February 1, 1997, the jury returned its verdict. Darlie Routier was found guilty of capital murder in the death of her 5-year-old son, Damon. 4 days later, the jury sentenced her to death. Importantly, Darlie was not convicted of Devin's death. She had been charged in connection with the deaths of both boys, but the capital murder conviction that resulted from the trial concerned Damon. The case did not end with the verdict. Darlie continued to maintain her innocence. Her attorneys pursued appeals and challenged aspects of the evidence used against her. Over the years, questions were also raised about forensic evidence from the crime scene. Modern DNA testing was eventually authorized on selected evidence. As of 2026, the conviction and death sentence remain in place, while the case continues to generate debate over disputed forensic evidence and DNA testing. Darlie remains on Texas's death row. There is another important detail that should not be overlooked. Darlie's surviving son, Drake, was only an infant when his two brothers were killed. After Darlie's conviction, custody arrangements were made for him to live with members of his father's family. The case has remained controversial partly because there are two completely different interpretations of what happened that night. The prosecution's position is that Darlie killed her sons and attempted to make investigators believe an intruder was responsible. Darlie and her supporters maintain that an intruder entered the house and that she was wrongly convicted. That distinction matters. Unlike some of the other mothers in this countdown, Darlie Routier has never confessed to killing her children. She has consistently denied responsibility. And legally, her status is clear. She was convicted of Damon's murder and sentenced to death. But the continuing debate surrounding the evidence means the case remains one of the most disputed maternal murder convictions in the United States. Whatever conclusion someone reaches about the disputed evidence, the human cost is undeniable. Devon was 6. Damon was 5. Their lives ended inside their own home. Their younger brother survived, and their family was permanently changed. The case also demonstrates something important about true crime. A conviction tells us what a jury concluded based on the evidence presented to it. But a responsible documentary should also distinguish between established facts, prosecution claims, defense arguments, and unresolved questions. In Darlie Routier's case, that distinction is especially important. The jury concluded that she murdered Damon. The court imposed a death sentence. She continues to deny it. And decades later, the legal battle and debate surrounding the evidence have not completely disappeared. We have now reached the end of our journey through some of the most disturbing cases involving mothers convicted of killing their own children. Each case was different. Marie Noe was connected to the deaths of 8 children and eventually pleaded guilty decades after the deaths occurred. Andrea Yates became the center of an extraordinary legal battle over severe mental illness and criminal responsibility. Susan Smith created a false kidnapping story after killing her 2 sons. Waneta Hoyt was convicted after years of unexplained infant deaths within her family. Marybeth Tinning was convicted in the death of her daughter Tammy Lynn, while questions surrounding other deaths remained. Diane Downs was convicted after blaming a mysterious attacker for an attack that killed one of her children and seriously injured 2 others. Keli Lane was convicted of murdering her infant daughter Tegan, whose body has never been found. Megan Huntsman pleaded guilty to killing 6 newborn children whose remains were discovered years later. And finally, Darlie Routier remains imprisoned after being convicted of murdering her 5-year-old son, while continuing to maintain her innocence. These cases are disturbing, not because motherhood itself is connected to violence. It isn't. They are disturbing because children are among the most vulnerable members of society, and the person responsible for protecting them is sometimes the person investigators ultimately identify as responsible for their deaths. At the same time, every case deserves to be examined carefully. A suspicion is not a conviction, an accusation is not proof, and a controversial case should never be presented as settled fact when important questions remain unresolved. Behind every headline were children with names, families, and lives that mattered. And that is perhaps the most important thing to remember when these stories are told. The crime may become famous, the investigation may become history, but the children should never become just another statistic. If you found this documentary informative, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and stay with us for more carefully researched stories about crime, mysteries, investigations, and the cases that continue to raise difficult questions.